is, in all its public commentary, refusing any deal that involves giving up Crimea. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky saying just negotiating with Russia, that's already a compromise. Andrij Dobriansky is here, Director of Communications Media for the Ukrainian Congress Committee for America, Chair of the UN Affairs for the Ukrainian World Congress. Welcome back. What about
Hi, thanks for having me again.
You're welcome. The talk about Crimea. What's your perspective? What should we know about this back and forth of the last few days?
This is something that has blown up online, especially over the last 10 years. The constant disinformation by Russia spilling out into people who are presidential advisors, like David Sachs and his comments about Crimea. We've heard Elon Musk, lots of people in the president's orbit saying it's so simple. You just give away one territory and the war will be over. As we've seen for now almost 100 days, the president is unable to get the deal that he promised, that is so simple to make and that he could do. And he is really approaching desperation with all this talk about Crimea or putting more pressure, which he promised in the Oval Office today. And yet we've seen no pressure on Russia.
So the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte is in town in Washington, and our White House correspondent Kelly Meyer just asked him a question about all of this. Here it is.
To the president when it comes to Crimea, in terms of Ukraine keeping that or not. What was your message to the president?
Again, these talks are ongoing. It doesn't work, and it doesn't help if I'm going to comment on every aspect of talks and what might be on the table or not. So I don't want to do that.
Okay, so he's avoiding that, but there is a larger question, Andrij, obviously, about what the Europeans are saying to President Trump behind closed doors, and even more so, what impact it might have. What do you think?
Well, it's beyond what the Europeans are saying. We heard John Bolton talking about this last night and for the last week, and everybody, including President Zelensky, re-upping the Pompeo declaration that was made in 2018, a declaration made in a Senate hearing with Marco Rubio present and pressing for even more sanctions against Russia. So the questionable thing is, as the NATO Secretary General is trying to not talk about the crazy things coming out of the White House, is how come we are reverting to some kind of foreign policy of Obama, as opposed to following what the Trump administration was doing during its first term, when, as the president said, no war continued on after that.
So a couple of things. I've had discussions, just in the last 2 days, with all sorts of different people, former ambassadors, military analysts, and the like. And let me play for you what former Ambassador Dan Baer had to say, and there's a few other points we could make. But this is what he says is at stake for essentially President Trump. Watch.
This is really Donald Trump's Neville Chamberlain moment. This is not something that is good for the United States in the long run. It's not only selling out Ukraine, it's selling out the United States, because we have an interest in not having it be solidified in law that countries can change borders by force.
That last part is what I'd like you to address a bit. This idea, because what Dan was really getting at is that it wouldn't be solidified in law, but there would be de facto control for Russia in a place like Crimea. It just wouldn't be recognized as such. What do you think?
All right, we have over a decade of precedents now with Crimea. You can't fly over Ukraine in general right now, but over the last 10 years, you could not take a flight to Ukraine because the International Airline Alliance was not recognized that as occupied territory. You can't mail a letter to Crimea. It goes all the way to Moscow, and then Moscow has to reroute it to Crimea. The entire world is agreed, over 100 nations voting from the very beginning of the war and the occupation of Crimea, that this is illegal. And they didn't want to see it. Now, why are global South countries saying that? Why do you think that Venezuela and Guyana, which are having a territorial dispute, or perhaps the countries of Africa, which very forcefully at the UN said, we did not draw our borders, that was the colonial powers, but we're not going to rip them up because that would entangle the entire continent in decades of war. So this is very important for many people in the world about not recognizing military occupation in any way going forward.
We've been talking about precedent. We've even referenced China and Taiwan as part of that conversation. But do you see a situation where Ukraine, not only borders and how they're drawn and how they're officially recognized at the UN and other places, but in a practical sense, that the Ukrainian government will govern in the Crimean Peninsula again? I mean, how does this end?
Absolutely. I mean, this is written into Ukrainian law, but this is actually reaffirmed numerous times in bilateral agreements with the United States. Ukraine has 2 charters of strategic partnership with the United States. We have many pieces of legislation that are just solely United States legislation, which says that the United States will never recognize occupied territory, and actually that it is the policy of the United States to help Ukraine retake that occupied territory. So this would not just require Ukraine to vote on changing its law and changing its constitution, but it will require the United States and numerous countries around the world to change already existing law that expressly forbid recognizing the occupation of Crimea.
I understand 100% what you're saying, but I don't know if that's the policy of the current, as you know this, U.S. administration, right? Final thoughts?
Final thoughts is let's go back to what we've already know worked, which is increasing pressure. We know that there's a bipartisan bill both in the House and in the Senate. Both Lindsey Graham and Dick Durbin, as well as Brian Fitzpatrick and Mike Quigley in the House, are working on legislation to ramp up sanctions immediately against Russia. This would be the pressure, the maximum pressure that Trump promised at the beginning of his administration. Let's go back to what was promised and get some pressure on Russia so we can actually go forward and not just do this. It's coming. It's coming. It's coming.
All right, Andrij Dobriansky, thank you again. We appreciate it. Always good to have you on.
Thank you.
We'll keep
Thank you
following
so
it.
much.
We'll keep talking about it now.